let's head to Gabon now, where President Ali Bongo is urging African nations to develop strategies in order to address climate change. And that's ahead of the upcoming United Nations Climate Conference in Egypt this November. Now, he said all this at the Africa Climate Week, which is currently underway in Gabon's capital, Libreville. Over 1,000 government officials and stakeholders are working to form strong African regional climate responses. The African Climate Week comes as the continent is reeling from several extreme weather events, such as drought in East Africa and the Horn of Africa, as well as sandstorms and extreme heat in West Africa's Sahel region, and also destructive flash floods in Central, Western, and Southern Africa. Now, African nations have requested about $1.2 trillion of international financial support by 2030 in order to implement their climate action plans. Of course, the international community is yet to honor those pledges. Well, let's now take apart some of these topics on the table at the Africa Climate Week. We're joined by Joseph Nganga. He's an executive director for Africa at the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet. Great to have you with us on the show, Mr. Nganga. Now, carbon markets, I'd like to start with that because that's one of the mitigation strategies that could certainly help Africa address the critical issue of funding its climate action plan. But of course, we know Africa has been slow to adopt the model. Give us some insight into what implementation of carbon markets looks like and talk to us about the opportunities in Africa.
Absolutely, and thank you for having me, Uche. I think you're absolutely right that carbon markets will play a significant role in financing renewable energy and development on the continent. But they face a significant challenge. Since 2015 to 2021, all the carbon market trading done, only 11% has come from the continent, which illustrates how big of a gap there is between what is coming from our continent versus elsewhere. And a lot of that is driven by a number of challenges. The first one, of course, is lack of proper policies and regulations that give investors confidence. The second is investors developing projects. So there's a lack of projects being developed on the continent. And the third one, of course, is lack of knowledge and expertise among local companies and developers. And if we can address those, the continent stands a chance to gain significant revenues. Numbers have been mentioned anywhere between $30 and $50 billion in revenues if the continent maximizes on its carbon opportunity.
Now, I started off with that because we talked about the fact that Africa needs about $1.2 trillion US dollars by 2030. And of course, only a fraction of that is currently on the table. And it's understandable when we see African governments reluctant to stop fossil fuel burning because our economies rely on that. So what are some of the other solutions besides carbon markets?
I believe that the renewable energy technology itself today is quite competitive with fossil fuels. I think given the need for substantial electrification on the continent, where 600 million Africans do not have access to electricity, African governments and African countries have an opportunity to use new technologies that are renewable to leapfrog oil and gas. Now, each country must decide where its resources are, how best to balance between the different sources of generation. But the reality is today, renewable energy is quite competitive and gives the continent an opportunity to electrify with renewable energy and not be caught with stranded assets if you build coal and gas plants. That being said, there is a huge gap in financing of this renewable energy technology. And so African governments and African countries still need significant international support. If not from other governments, then private sector must step in and invest into these renewable energy opportunities for the continent.
Well, one good thing, Mr. Nganga, is that we're also seeing several African governments rethinking their climate strategies and launching new energy transition plans. For example, Nigeria, it just launched its own plan, one that it says will require about $10 billion per year. And you have to ask where they're going to get that financing. But what are your thoughts on that plan? And how does it compare to other similar plans you've seen on the continent?
I think I'd like to start by congratulating the government of Nigeria for being forward thinking and planning ahead and investing in Nigeria's future from a resilience perspective. I think the work that has gone into that plan is quite credible and quite impressive. It shows leadership on the continent in terms of thinking ahead and planning. The 10 billion a year is a substantial amount, and that is on top of everything else that the government of Nigeria needs to be supplying. Some of that must come from the international community. Look, the climate issue is a global issue. If we don't help countries like Nigeria and other developing countries electrify through new technology, by 2050, this will be countries that will be producing more than 50% of emissions on globally. So the onus is on all of us to support emerging countries electrify with renewable energy. And so we do know that Nigeria is now on a roadshow looking to raise that money from the international community. And the international community must step up and support this fundraising effort to support the continent.
Well, let's talk about what the Global Energy Alliance is doing, because we know you've been working to accelerate and also scale equitable energy transitions in low and middle income nations globally. Talk to us about your strategy and some of the projects are currently ongoing on the continent.
Absolutely. So the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet has been set up by large philanthropies, so Rockefeller, IKEA, and Bezos. And alongside the Global Energy Alliance partners, who include over 18 organizations, we're looking to invest $10 billion towards this very agenda. And the agenda is actually three outcomes that we're targeting. The first is to drive electrification. As I mentioned earlier, 600 million Africans are not electrified. Um, the second is to drive jobs. As you provide people with electricity, we want to make sure that they're using that electricity not just for lighting and charging their mobile phones, but also driving the economic development and job creation, so productive use. And the third part is driving CO2 reduction. So all our efforts are towards encouraging countries and governments to use renewable energy to drive the electrification, thus reducing CO2. How do we work? We work closely with government and other alliance partners to understand what is each government's priorities for its people and where are their bottlenecks. We then apply philanthropic capital to unlock other people's money to make sure that the billions of dollars that may be available but may not be flowing because of either lack of local capacity or lack of adequate risk mitigation is unlocked and is flowing fast. So, as the alliance in Nigeria, for example, which is one of our priority countries in Africa, we are supporting several programs, including bulk procurement, where we help developers of mini grids procure significant volumes of solar panels, batteries, and other infrastructure. And by buying it at bulk, we ensure that we're getting competitive prices, which leads to more competitive end user prices, which support investors to get a viable return and hopefully build a virtuous cycle that accelerates electrification. We are also very fortunate and very proud to be supporting the presidency in Nigeria with the Energy Transition Office, where we hope to continue contributing to Nigeria's ambition, an impressive ambition to meet their energy transition goals. We are also looking to support investors and mini grid developers looking to close over 170 mini grids this year with a view to electrifying a substantial number of Nigerians, potentially up to 60 million in the next 10 to 15 years.